So balance changes went live yesterday. Today's the 9th. If you're watching this later, they went live a couple days ago, maybe. Who knows? They changed two cards via a mid-patch update. This is the first time they've done a mid-patch update, and I think that it was great. It actually is going to help the metagames. Glenn Jones, principal game designer over at Second Dinner, shared some behind the scenes. We'll talk about that. Let's talk about the changes real fast. Zabu got nerfed. Technically kind of a side change. Zabu went down in 1 energy, but at the cost of now only discounting by 1. So when you discount by 1, it's gonna make it so you can't do those turn 4, turn 5 combos where you're playing more than 1 4 cost, unless you're playing cards like Sarah, Mystique to get another Zabu ability, or even Quinjet with Moon Girl you could technically play out 2 on turn 5. So Spider-Man, Absorber-Man might not be dead. Spider-Man might not be dead if you are a Quinjet gamer. We'll have to see. I think this is a great change because it'll severely limit those kind of toxic double Spider-Man plays a lot. It also, you can't play out like 3 4-drops on turn 6. The fact you can't play out 2. So this is going to be a pretty big change where you're going to be now just changing up the types of decks this puts it in. I'll talk about it a little bit later, what types of decks that I think Zabu will now be good in. But for now, let's move on to Surfer. Surfer, also a card that was dominating the meta. Not quite as much as Zabu, I'd say, but it was very strong. And I think they talked about it a little bit in their release that they thought Surfer with a Zabu nerf would become way too dominant. So they wanted to get ahead of the game and make sure that this got hit a little bit as well. They were saying that it was at the very top of the metagame pre-Zabu. It was in the top 5, but they said some people were able to find ways to counteract it. I think that might be true. It might not have been as dominant, but it still was like a class of its own above a lot of other cards in the similar slot for this. So I think this is a great change. It'll bring it more in line with a lot of the other cards that are at 3 costs. Like, it's still better than Ironheart and some other cards, but it is definitely brought in line as you would expect with a lot of these nerfs. They've done a pretty good job in the past with their nerfs, making sure that they don't kill the cards, and it's never their intention to kill the cards, especially since these two are the latest 2 season pass cards. So with that, let's go and talk about what they said about these nerfs. So they went in a bit about why they do balance changes, and it's exactly what they said. They want to make sure that the metagame is diverse and that it allows for new card releases to actually be able to play in the meta. Because if cards stay too dominant and they dominate the meta, you're not going to be able to see that diversity. Those new cards that get released just won't get played because they're not going to be able to compete. So they talk about how they decided to do nerfs, and one thing is that they look at a couple things. They look at the individual cards, and then they look at the clusters that those cards are used in. So clusters would mean like decks basically, but since decks aren't 12 unique cards a lot of times, since you can slot in like 4 or 5 different cards into a deck, a lot of times they have to just cluster it and say like this cluster of cards makes up a group that is like a deck archetype basically. So they're calling those clusters, and then they basically say that within these 2 different things that they're looking at, they look at a couple different things. So for the individual cards, the main thing that they focus on is drawn win percentage, which I agree with. That's a very common thing to use in card games, since if you don't draw the card, you can't really tell how good it is. And played win percent is going to be very difficult to ascertain like how good the card is, because you have to have the right conditions to play cards a lot of times. So played win percent is not necessarily as good of a metric. Then they also look at popularity, which is also key, because if a card is very, very popular, its win rate might not be as high as if it was lower, since the metagame might have evolved around that card to try and straight up counter that card. So the metagame sometimes will become the strong card being played, and then every other deck is trying to counter that. So popularity is very important, because as popularity goes down, the win rate could go up. As popularity goes up, it could go down. So you have to take into account that if it's played in 75% of decks, it's probably pretty good if its win rate is still staying pretty high. Cube contribution. This is obviously like just another type of win percentage. So it's just the number of cubes that the card is giving to the player based on how it's played. So like the average cube rate that it's gaining. Because sometimes some cards in Marvel Snap, you have to be a little bit sneaky to get those extra cubes a lot of times. And sometimes some decks are more consistent than others. So the win rate might be low, but since you know when you're going to win or not, a lot of times the cube rate goes up. So something like Galactus, where when you get Galactus off, you know you're going to win. So you're able to snap preemptively, know you're going to get that Galactus off, which will give you a higher cube rate than maybe the win rate, because maybe you're not getting Galactus off as often as you would like. And then for clusters, they focus on a couple key important things here. So they want to look at how the win percentage is against the field, but then they also look at the individual matchups. So I think that's kind of important as well. So if a deck is very good across the board against multiple matchups, that deck means that it doesn't really have very many good counters and not many things can compete against it, which does show that it's just too dominant a lot of times and it needs some tweaking. And then also popularity, so that's also important. So if that one archetype has become too popular again, same thing with the card popularity. But yeah, so then they basically take all those into account and then they make a watch list. And then if any combination of those different things that they're looking at gets exceeded, they will put it up for balance changes, and they'll probably go through some process of deciding what to change. What is their goal with these changes? Do they want to just bring it down and the interactions with some cards? So for example, Zabu, they decided to do that nerf. A big part of that was to limit the Spider-Man kind of viability. They didn't want to play two Spider-Mans out on the same turn, a lot of that kind of stuff. So they talk about it down here. And then with Surfer, they just preemptively changed it so that it wasn't dominating the meta post Zabu nerf, which I think is great, because I think even with Zabu, it was still like a very, very strong archetype. Then lastly, they just talked about future balance changes. They said they might want to experiment with more frequent changes on a small scale. So I'm hoping to see that. I like more changes more frequently, but they did say that the main way that they want to do changes is still with patches, because I don't think that their mid-patch technology they have right now allows them to do too much other than tweak the numbers. So we'll have to see what they end up doing in the future, but I'm hoping for more. And then just quickly, new decks that you can make with Zabu and Surfer. Not necessarily that new, but I think Zabu, one thing in particular, since you could play it on turn 2 and then you could play a 4-cost on turn 5, I think one of the strongest things that this became is basically a better Psylocke in your Mr. Negative deck. So Negative Zabu is definitely going to be a deck that you want to take a look at. So you can just run Zabu in the place of a Psylocke in Mr. Negative deck. So you can play Zabu into Mr. Negative on turn 3, which will then give you more draws, and then you could end up still playing Sarah out. I have this list which still plays out Silver Surfer. I'm not so sure if Silver Surfer is going to be that good in a list like this, but this is just like a Wong, Surfer, Ironheart, Mr. Negative list. The main combo in these Mr. Negative lists is a lot of times Iron Man, Mystique. So that's a place to get a lot of the power. And then another place I think that is interesting, that not many people have too much access to, is a Sauron list. So I used to run Zabu in my Sauron list when it was a 3-drop. I did run Moon Girl in this list previously, but I think with Zabu nerfs, I think it'll be interesting to get Zabu down on 2. Sauron still played on 3, because Sauron will interact with Zabu, so you can't play it later on. But I don't think you really want to be playing Sauron or Zabu that much later on anyway. But if you're able to play it out, then you can play out you can play out a Wong sometimes on turn 3 instead of the Sauron. Get that Shuri out there as well. You can play out some of your 1-drops with your 4-drops. It does add a little bit more. I haven't really tested this list yet. I was just trying to think of ways that we could use Zabu. So we'll have to see how this does in the new meta. And then one cool new thing that you can do is with a Silver Surfer deck, you can actually play Cerebro 2 with Surfer now. So Silver Surfer now being a 2-power card and giving your 3-cost cards 2 plus 2 power. That means that both your Cerebro and your Mystique get +2 power, so they become part of your Cerebro. I left Brood in this, even though it would get buffed. The only thing is, with this Brood play, you would have to play Brood after Silver Surfer in this deck. Brood could probably be cut, but it's just such a good card in Cerebro 2 that I did not cut it. But I do think that this would be a very interesting deck. Obviously, with this deck, you could cut a card like Umbaku and play another 1-2 card as well. but I think that this would actually be a very interesting archetype with Silver Surfer. Just the change actually put it into viability. Very cool deck. But yeah, so tell me what you guys think. What do you think about the nerfs? Do you hope that they do more nerfs in the future? How have you been liking the new metagame? If you guys want to subscribe to the channel, feel free to do that too. You know, I'm going to be putting out a lot more videos in the future, talking about doing more deck reviews and everything. But yeah, thanks everybody. See you in the next one.